In our nation today, the line between right and wrong continues to shift. What used to be considered wrong is now considered right. What used to be considered right is now wrong. We look around and we see corruption in government, in business. The philosophy of our nation has become, if it feels good, do it. Believe anything you want, just keep it to yourself. Honesty and morality are a matter of convenience. If keeping my word benefits me, then I'll do it, but if it doesn't, I won't. Divorce is a great example of this. Divorce is rampant in our nation. When we stand at the altar, we say, "Till death do us part." But what we really mean is until I'm unhappy. We don't keep our word. The truth is, what we need men and women of moral courage to stand up for what's right, to do what's right. But this is the culture we live in. And the temptation for us, for all of us, is to go with it, to go with the flow. Don't fight it. Do what the Romans do. Don't cause a fuss. Just go with it. But I think most of us would agree that our nation needs to change. Even if you don't agree with the Bible, you see all of the stuff that's going on in the news, in our political system, everything, you can tell, you realize that our nation needs to change. Something needs to change. We need more men and women of moral courage who will stand up for what's right and be the agents of change in our nation. We need to be those men and women of moral courage who stand up for what's right so that we can change our culture, change our nation. But you may be going, "Wait, but Pastor, that's too big. How do I change my nation? How do I change this culture? I'm nobody. I don't have any political influence. I don't have any social influence. I'm just me. How do I bring about change?" And the answer to that is simple. To cause change, you have to be changed. Let me say that again. To cause change, you have to be changed. So often what we do is we complain about the moral decline of our nation and culture, and then we turn around and do the very things we just complained that everybody else is doing. Change starts at home. When we change, then we can influence others to change. You would be amazed at the impact that you can have if you just simply stand up in your own house and say, "This is my house, and we will not do what is wrong. We will serve God no matter what." You would be amazed at how impacting that can be to the people around you, at your work, in your neighborhood, in your own family. When you stand up and you have the moral courage to stand up and say, "No, I will not do what is wrong. I'm going to serve God. I'm going to do what's right." There's an amazing story in the Bible that illustrates what I'm talking about. It's a story of a teenager, no less. A teenager. In fact, a couple of them. 4 of them to be exact. 4 teenagers that decided they were going to live for God. They were going to honor God no matter what, even if it killed them. And because of their decision, because of their moral courage, and their integrity, they ended up influencing a king. And by influencing this king, they influenced the nation. The story is the story of Daniel. It's in the book of Daniel. And we're going to talk about it, but let me set this up for you. Let me give you some background to this story, the story of Daniel. How many of you ever read that story? Awesome story. I encourage you. We're going to be in a series for the next several weeks, and I want to encourage you, go read the whole story so you're ready for when we come back on Sunday, because it's a powerful story. Daniel was born into a wealthy family. He was well educated. He was born he was a Jew, an Israelite, right? And he was part of the royal family. Okay? Well educated. He was healthy. He was smart, right? Daniel had a high social standing. He was a relative of the king of Judah. He was raised with privilege and status, right? He was a young man with a future. He would have probably been voted most likely to succeed in high school, right? Keep in mind, he was a teenager, about 14 when all this happened. And what happened was that Daniel was caught in a world system, in a culture that forgot God. Basically, the Israelites, they gave up on God. They turned their back on God. His family, his people, they decided, we don't want God in our life. We want to do things our way. God repeatedly sent prophets to warn the people of Israel, but they continued to rebel against Him. In 605 BC, God allowed the superpower of that day, Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army, to attack Jerusalem and take over as judgment against them. God said, listen, you're going to turn your back on me, then I'm going to let this guy, this Nebuchadnezzar, these Babylonians come in and wipe you out and take over your city, your nation. Before returning to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, set up a puppet government in Jerusalem. And as an insurance policy that there would be no further rebellion or anything like that, what he did was he took members of the royal family back to Babylon as captives. Daniel was one of them. What Nebuchadnezzar planned to do was he called for Daniel and his friends to be rigorously trained and indoctrinated for 3 years. Basically, he took these young guys, Daniel and his friends, and he said, listen, I'm going to make you Babylonians. I'm going to strip you of your culture. I'm going to strip you of your God, and I'm going to make you like me. 14 years old. They have to deal with this. Think about the pressure. Let me show you. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 through 20. This is what happens. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 through 20. During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia, and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Aspenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The idea here was to turn these young Jewish boys into Babylonians. stripped them of their God, stripped them of their culture, and turned them into Babylonians. The king gave them new names, stripped them of their names. Gave them a new education. Now here's what's interesting. The king of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar, he was anti-God. The Israelite, the God of heaven. He was anti-God. Right? That's why he took the articles of the temple and placed them in his own treasury, in the treasury of his God. Right? Basically what he's saying is like, listen, my God is bigger than your God. Right? And that's how I took over your nation. Right? Your God's nothing. My God is bigger. Imagine the pressure put on this 14-year-old boy and his friends. Everything he was taught was being stripped away. Everything he was told was wrong. He's now being told, hey, it's okay. Everything that he was told was right. Now he's being told, no, it's wrong. Don't do it. Don't worship that God. He's weak. He's not going to do anything for you. We have the superior gods. You worship our God. You do what we do. 14 years old. 14 years old. To make matters worse, the king tries to entice them to give up what they believe with sumptuous food. How many of you have ever been to like an awesome buffet, right? An awesome dinner house. Oh, the food is good, baby. Right? I love it. I love food. I'm telling you. Well, think about these. These guys are prisoners, right? They're sitting in a cell, and the king starts bringing them the best food ever. Says, hey, live it up, guys. This is what we get to eat. In Babylon, this is what we get to eat all the time. Become one of us. And this is what you get. Can you imagine the temptation here? Can you imagine the pressure? Now here's the interesting thing. In Daniel 1, verses 1 through 20, it says this: the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. What the king is trying to say here, he's trying to send a message. He's trying to say, hey, I'm your provider. Look to me for everything you need. Look at how great it is to live here. He's trying to get them to give up their culture. But here's the problem. You see, the food that they were giving to the Israelites, the food that the Babylonians would eat, what they would do is before they would serve it, before they would eat it, right, they would actually sacrifice it, consecrate it up to their gods, right? That's how they did this. Their food was given up to their gods as worship, and then they would eat it. Now, in the law of God, the God of heaven, the law of the Israelite God, says that to eat anything that has been sacrificed to an idol is sin. Absolutely wrong. And the Israelites were not supposed to do it. Now think about the pressure on this 14-year-old boy and his friends. This is all they were serving. They're in a prison cell. There's no McDonald's that they can go to. There's no Taco Bell that they can slip off to and eat. They have nothing else. And I got to tell you, this food probably smelled really good. But to eat it would have been wrong. It would have been wrong. Daniel had a decision to make. Give in and join the crowd, or take a stand. To give in would have been easy, right? That's the easy way. All he had to do was make light of it and say, hey, it's really no big deal. It's just eating food. Come on. Right? I mean, maybe you're sitting here and you're thinking the same thing. Dude, it's just food. What's the big deal? Right? This is the temptation for all of us whenever we're being pressured to do something that we know is wrong is we have that temptation to make light of it and say, it's no big deal. It's no big deal. And we brush it off. How many times have you done that? How many times have you just decided, you know what, I don't want to deal with the pressure anymore. You know what, it's okay. It's not that bad. Can I just tell you that when you make that decision, when you make light of something that you know is wrong, that you're not exercising moral courage in that moment. But the temptation is there because we don't want to make waves. We don't want to stand out. We don't want people to ridicule us or mock us. We just want to have no problems. But making that kind of choice doesn't help shape our culture for God. When we constantly give in to pressure and do what we know to be wrong, simply because we don't want to make waves, we are not helping the problem. We're making it worse. Because the people of this world, they're not seeing a difference between you and them. And they need to see a difference. You see, to them, all the Christians look like them. Because the Christians are doing the same things they're doing. And they need to know that there's a better way. And that's only going to happen when we have moral courage and we stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do this. It's wrong. Daniel chose instead to take a stand. And he did. In Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 through 20, it says this, "But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods." You see, Daniel saw what happened to his people when they disobeyed God. When they kept saying, it's no big deal, we're going to do things our way. We're not going to serve God. We're going to do it our way. You see, Daniel lived through the punishment that happens when you do that. The consequences that happen when you live that way. His nation was wiped out. Was taken over. He was moved from his nation, his land, his family, and he was taken to a foreign land as a captive. You see, Daniel saw firsthand the consequences that happen when you turn from God. You know, when you're feeling pressure to compromise and sin, it's so easy to look only at the immediate consequences. It's so easy to look at those immediate consequences and go, you know what? You know, if I stand for what's right, you know what? My friends aren't going to like me, or you know what? This is going to happen. You know what? Something bad's going to happen. The IRS, man, I'm going to owe a lot of money. I need to fudge on my taxes a little bit. You know? I need to lie to my boss because you know what? I mean, otherwise I might get fired. We only see those immediate consequences. But I guarantee you there are much deeper consequences when you do what's wrong. Ask the teenage girl who gives it to her boyfriend to have sex and then finds herself pregnant. There are much deeper consequences. Ask the man who gives in to pressure from his boss to lie and then finds himself under investigation by the police. Ask the mother who always wanted to be the cool mom, so never set any limits for her kids. And now they're living broken lives. There are always deeper consequences. Now Daniel's being pressured to go along with the crowd and compromise his beliefs. Yet the Bible says this, but Daniel was determined. Daniel wasn't going to compromise his beliefs or his integrity no matter what the cost. He was determined to live for God. He was determined to do what was right no matter what. Even if it killed him. That's moral courage. Do you have that kind of courage? To stand for what's right, no matter what the cost is. Before we can help anyone else to live for God, we have to be determined to live for Him ourselves. We have to be determined not to compromise. You have to draw a line in the sand and say, no, I will not cross this line no matter what. If my kids say they hate me for not letting them watch that movie, so be it. If my boss fires me because I refuse to lie, so be it. If my boyfriend breaks up with me because I won't have sex with him, so be it. I will not compromise. We have to be determined. Determined to live for God no matter what. This is how we change our culture. When we are changed. Now watch what God does when we make that kind of stand. When we determine that we're not going to compromise. Watch what God does for His people. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1 through 20 says this. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. What I want you to understand is to refuse to eat the prescribed food by the king was an act of treason. Yet when Daniel determined not to give in, not to compromise, when he determined to stand for what was right, he wasn't alone. God gave him favor with the guard. Whenever we take a stand for God, He's always going to be there to help us. The ultimate question that we have to answer is when we face this pressure, is do we trust Him? Do we trust Him with the consequences that we see right in front of us? Do we trust Him to help us through that? Do we trust Him to help us find that new job if we get fired? Do we trust Him to help us with our children when they get angry at us because we didn't let them do something that they wanted to do? Do we trust Him to provide that new boyfriend when that loser gets dropped? Do we trust Him? That's the question. There's nothing God can't do for you. He gave Daniel so much favor with the chief guard that he was willing to risk going against the king's order in order to help Daniel out. Think about that for a moment. What did this guy have to gain? What did he have to gain? He had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And yet he risked his life to help Daniel out. When God is for you, who can be against you? But you have to choose, are you living for God? Do you have the moral courage to stand up and say, no, I won't cross that line, no matter what it costs me? Not only does God help you when you take a stand for Him, but He opens doors of influence for you. This is what I'm talking about. If we want to change our culture, we have to be changed first. But when we make that stand and we become changed, God's going to begin to open the doors of influence, and you're going to begin to influence the people around you. Listen to this. It says this in verse 17. God gave these 4 young men. Notice it said God gave. It wasn't some natural thing, some natural ability. This was something that God gave them. And it says God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Talk about influence. God found in Daniel, Azariah, Mishael, and the other guy. He found in them people that he could trust. People that he could trust to influence this king and this nation. And so he gave them tremendous influence. By influencing the king, they influenced the culture of Babylon. Especially in that culture. Now, in our culture, we have a president, so we're run a lot by the people, right? So there may not be as much influence if President Trump were to, turn towards God. I'm not saying he's not with God, but I'm just saying, that may not happen. But in that culture, what the king decided, that was law, right? Any whim the king had, man, that's the way things went. So when they had influence with the king, they had influence with the nation. So instead of these Babylonians influencing these Israelite boys to give up their God and their culture, with God's help, these boys are now in a position to influence the nation of Babylon for God. Interesting, isn't it? These Babylonians tried to strip them of their culture, strip them of their God, turn them against Him. And instead, now they're influencing the king and the rest of the culture for God. All because they had moral courage to stand for what was right. I want to show you the progression of the king, the change that the king went through. Each time Daniel and his friends took a stand and did what was right, God backed them up and did something amazing, and it influenced the king. One of the first times was Daniel, the king is given a dream by God. And the king calls all his magicians and his enchanters, and he says, listen, I want you to interpret my dream. And they're getting ready to do it. And he says, whoa, wait a second. How do I know you're not going to just tell me something that some weird meaning that has, and you just made it up? So he says, you know what, I'm going to test you. Not only do I want you to tell me the interpretation of the dream, but you have to tell me the dream itself. I'm not going to tell you what it is. You tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me the meaning. And of course, they're freaking out. They're like, no king ever has ever asked us to do that. We can't do that. How do we know what you dreamed? And he says, okay, then all of you are going to be killed. And so he issues an order to kill all of his advisors, including Daniel. Daniel gets word. He says, hold on. Let me come meet with the king. And he says, listen, king, I can't do it either, but there's a God in heaven who can. He can tell you not only your dream, but he can tell you the meaning. Give me some time to pray. King says, okay. Daniel comes back and tells him exactly what he dreamed and exactly what it meant. Amen. And this is what the king says. The king said to Daniel, truly, your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this secret. Think about this. First, he started out anti-God. My gods are better than your gods. Now he says, your God is bigger. Your God is better. Later, he decides to build a statue and have everybody worship it. Many believe it was a statue of himself. A huge statue. And he orders everybody to bow down and worship it. And if you don't, you're going to be killed, thrown into a fiery furnace. We're going to talk about this next week. Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to bow down and worship the statue. The king gets upset, throws them in the fiery furnace, and they walk around as if nothing's wrong. King's looking in the window. He's going, what the heck? How is this even possible? And he finally calls them out and says, come out, come out. And so they come out, and then this is what he says. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore, I make this decree, if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. There is no other God who can rescue like this. Hallelujah. Later, the king has another dream. This one's more personal. You see, the king got a little prideful. After all that has happened, he still doesn't recognize God's authority, God's power, and that God is the one that has given him everything that he has. And so he kind of looks out over his kingdom and says, look what I've done. And God gives him a dream that he's going to turn him into a wild man. Like a wild animal. Literally, he talks about eating grass. Okay? I mean, he's going to turn him into a crazy man. Until he finally relents and says, God, you're the source. You're the source. You are it. So the king looks out over his property and says, he ignores the dream. Daniel interprets the dream and says, listen, king, you gotta turn from your wickedness. You gotta start acknowledging God. King ignores him, looks out over his property and says, look what I did. Look what I built. And immediately God strikes him. And he turns him into this wild man. It says his fingernails are all long. He's running around. The people probably are going, oh my gosh, that used to be our king, you know. I mean, he's eating grass. This guy's freaked out, okay? He's like that, I don't even remember how long, but it's like that for a while. Until finally he looks up to heaven and acknowledges in his heart that God is the source. That God is the King of Kings. And when he does that, God puts him in his right mind, and eventually he's restored as the king. I'm not quite sure what they thought about that, but they restored him. And this is what he says. This is the biggest change ever. He says this, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. All his acts are just and true. and he is able to humble the proud. Notice the change. Before it was always Daniel's God, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. Now he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and glorify and honor the King of heaven. Because Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had moral courage. They stood up for what was right. They did not bow. They did not bend. They did not compromise. And because they didn't do those things, they influenced a king. Not only did he give up, or not only did he change his religion, but he began to change his ways. Change how he lived. And guarantee you, it affected the nation. You want to know how you can change this nation? Be changed. Be changed. Decide for yourself that today I'm deciding I am going to be a person of moral courage. I'm going to stand for what's right. Whatever it costs me, I don't care. I'm going to do what's right, no matter what. I want to ask you if you would make that commitment today. If you're here, if you would say, I want to be that person of moral courage. Listen, nobody's here saying that it's not going to be easy, but you know what? A couple of 14-year-olds could do it, and they were in a lot worse situation than you. Here's the question. Are you going to do it? Are you going to stand for what's right? If so, here's what I want you to do. I want you to make a commitment today. I want you to commit before God and say, God, I want to be that person. I want to be that person of moral courage that influences my nation, influences my job, influences my neighborhood,